Thank you so much, Amy. I was going to take this up and wander, and now I'm seeing that camera, and that you'll be annoyed with me if I wander, won't you?
Never annoyed.
It's also taped down. Sorry.
Yeah, all right. Okay. Cells sort of stay in place. Good morning, everybody. It's really delightful to see you. It's a great turnout for a winter Saturday morning, and so I'm grateful to the staff who have worked so hard to prepare for this day, and especially grateful to all of you who've taken the time to be here. Thank you for coming. So, one fine day at St. Paul's in Cleveland Heights, the parish where I had the joy and privilege of serving for 10 years. One fine day, we were doing a Bible study. I think it must have been Advent, because it's from the propers for one of the Sundays in Advent. And it's the story from the 3rd chapter of Luke, in which John the Baptist is down by the river, and the crowds are coming, and he is greeting them in that warm, hospitable, tactful way that he always did. Calling them vipers and telling them to repent. And so they're hearing the message that they need to change their lives in some way and realign their lives with God's will for them and for the world. And so they wonder how they could do that. Crowds asked John, "What then should we do?" In reply, he said to them, "Whoever has 2 coats must share with anyone who has none, and whoever has food must do likewise." So his first reply to the whole crowd that has arrived is a kind of a classic feed and clothe the poor mandate. Right? But then 2 particular subgroups come to him and pursue the question in a little more depth. So it goes on to say, tax collectors came to be baptized, and they asked him, "Teacher, what should we do?" He said to them, "Collect no more than the amount prescribed for you." And then soldiers also came and asked him, "And we, what should we do?" And he said to them, "Do not extort money from anyone by threats or false accusation, and be satisfied with your wages." So as we reflected on this passage, we saw 2 kind of gospel mandates. And the first one was this, as I said a moment ago, sort of classic feed and clothe the hungry and poor mandate. A kind of a mandate for the sort of work that many of us in our congregations are engaged in, that has to do with making sure that those who are in our midst, who are hungry or naked, have their needs met. But then the second part of this passage relates to a slightly different take on the gospel mandate, and that has to do with the use of authority and power in Jesus speaking to tax collectors and soldiers. And the bottom line in his response to them is, you have to use your authority and power in ways that are just. In ways that are just. And so we have in this one short passage, this one little scene down by the Jordan River, this combination of, if you will, ministries of compassion and relief, and also a mandate for attention to justice in places of authority and power. So as we talked about this at St. Paul's, we tried to look at the ministries of our congregation through the lens of this twofold mandate from John. And we reckoned that we were doing pretty well on the first one. We were involved with a number of ministries in terms of feeding and clothing ministries, but that we weren't sure how well we were doing on the latter, or what we were doing, or frankly, how to get started. The whole question about having a voice in the realm of justice is a very vexing question for most of us as individuals and even as congregations. Because what's the vehicle for us to do that? How do we even get started on questions as large as that? One fine day in the corridors of St. Paul's, one of the older members came to me and he pointed out a picture over in the corner. It was a picture taken in 1963 of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the chancel steps of that church. And it turned out that in 1963, the rector and the Bishop of Ohio had issued an invitation to Dr. King to come and speak at the church. 1963. This was still quite a controversial invitation to have been issued. There are actually a couple of sort of histories of the civil rights movement that suggest that this was one of the earliest occasions of a large white suburban congregation inviting Dr. King to speak. And so along the way, someone had printed out a picture of him there on the chancel steps and put it on the wall, but it was kind of over in the corner. So this parishioner said to me, we need to make this picture bigger and frame it fancier and put it someplace really prominent. So we had a conversation. And in the end, we concluded that if that picture was just a shrine to this past moment of glory, then we actually weren't entitled to frame it bigger and make it more prominent. Amen. That it had to represent some kind of current, ongoing reality in the life of the congregation. Amen. And then we could put it there, both to recollect with gratitude a courageous moment of our forebears, but also to continue to inspire us to the values represented by the photograph and by the person in the photograph. Amen. So we left it where it was for the time being, while we sort of collectively scratched our heads about our life as a congregation. One fine day at St. Paul's, some folks were talking about the general demographics of the congregation vis-a-vis the general demographics of the city in which we reside. The city, the specific city we were in was Cleveland Heights, an inner ring suburb just on the east side of the city of Cleveland. And the city of Cleveland Heights is almost precisely 50-50 black and white. St. Paul's demographics were about 95-5 white, black. So we were reflecting on this reality and on ways that we might push against that. And though we knew it was only a beginning, we felt that one thing we wanted to do was to be in conversation with some of our friends and neighbors whose congregation's demographics were the reverse of ours. So we discovered that many members in the congregation, through school involvements and other community involvements, were members of, friends were members at a church called Olivet Institutional Baptist Church on the east side of Cleveland. It's one of the sort of powerhouse historic African-American churches in Cleveland. It was pastored at the time by a man named Otis Moss, who was sort of granddaddy in the civil rights movement. He was near retirement. This was about 8 years ago, but still the pastor there. And so Pastor Moss and I got together, and we decided that our two congregations would have joint book studies for a while, just as something to get our congregants together, have conversation, have fellowship, and begin to sort of put our feet into the waters of conversation about bigger issues. So we did that for several years. We would get together and have these book studies, and at first they were sort of state occasions. You know, Pastor Moss would give an address, and I would give a prayer, and everybody would pray. And then gradually they became less state occasions and more kind of extended family events. So that after a couple of years, people said, we love this. We love that we're having potluck suppers and reading books together. But now we want to do something together. So we started scratching our heads about what that might be. One fine day in Cleveland, a young man arrived from Boston, as it happens. He was affiliated with the Industrial Areas Foundation, IAF. Some of you know the organization. It's one of a number of community organizing organizations that bring people together around issues of common concern in the civic realm. And so he had been involved with a GBIO, the Greater Boston, help me out, Interfaith Organization, right, as a young man. So he now was working for IAF, and he came to Cleveland to find out whether there was the will among Cleveland religious leaders to begin an affiliate for the IAF to get at issues of common concern. And indeed, there was a will, to make a long story short. The Greater Cleveland Congregations, as it came to be called, ramped up faster than any IAF affiliate in its history. sort of went from 0 to 60 because there was this sort of pent-up yearning and need on the part of religious leaders and their congregants to have a vehicle to get at those harder, big picture, upstream kind of systemic issues. Such was the will that this organization came into being very quickly, and I want to tell you that our congregation was among the 4 first to sign on and lead in the formation of that organizing effort. And it was in large measure precisely because of the relationship work that we'd already been doing with Olivet Institutional Baptist Church. So Olivet and St. Paul's and one of the synagogues and the Episcopal Cathedral downtown were the 4 kind of initial movers in getting that organization underway. And so, as you may know, in terms of organizing efforts such as those of IAF and other organizers, frequently you sort of figure out what's going to be the first issue, and there are always so many, so you have to start somewhere. And it happened that what we started with had to do with sentencing guidelines, because just a very small amount of research showed that the application of sentencing guidelines in the courts didn't even begin to be equitable in its application vis-a-vis the race of the perpetrators. And so this was patently unjust and something which we as people of faith felt needed to be looked at and addressed. So we started really simply. We organized a candidate forum at which the candidates for prosecutor were brought together and simply asked what did they think about this issue and how might they address it were they to be elected. So it was something as simple as any community League of Women Voters or other good organizations might have put together, but it was done from a faith perspective, and it was a start. And then that organization's gone on, Greater Cleveland Congregations, to address all kinds of other issues, healthcare, criminal justice system, jobs, lots of things. But it started with relationships, and it started small. One fine day in 2013, the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's address to St. Paul's rolled around. May 13th, 1963 was the date, so May 13th, 2013. So we had a big celebration, and Pastor Moss came and preached, and we reframed that picture, and we made it bigger, and we put a plaque on it that said what it represented, and we put it in a prominent place, because by this point, about 5 years after that initial conversation, we felt that it represented a reality in the life of the congregation. Not a completed, done thing, but a reality in who we were, in terms of actually trying to get at the gospel mandate and the ideals represented by that photograph. So what I simply want to say to you, and then turn it over to my sister so that she has her 10 minutes, is it started with Bible study. It started with simple conversations. It started with some potluck suppers. It started with some book study groups. It started with a relatively straightforward issue, not an unimportant one, but a relatively sort of focused issue. And it all built from there, one step at a time, one little step at a time, to get ourselves involved in these large systemic issues that can seem so overwhelming to us. But I'm grateful that you're here and that you have an interest in seeing how you too might be involved in these sorts of ministries of the gospel, so that down by the Jordan, we're hearing sort of both sides of John's message to us. Thanks for being here.